disability discrimination, particularly in workplaces. I think that should lead us to looking at some of the fundamental principles that could guide any change strategy within an organization. And I think the last aspect I'll be looking at is how we can use the position that's within an organization, how we could benchmark and some sort of measure of progress which we make in terms of disability equality and inclusion. So basically that provides a framework for the presentation tonight. Let's just begin with looking at some of the data relating to disability. We know that the World Health Organization data, current data, provides that there are about 15 million people in the world who are disabled. And if you look at about 1 billion people, about 15% of the world population basically are disabled. Now that figure alone gives you an idea of the amount of persons who we are dealing here with generally. And if you look at the UK statistics, again, the data there is not very favorable. From the National Office of Statistics in the UK, you could see that disabled persons in the UK constitute about 18% of the population. And we're looking here at the general population of more than 66 million persons. In terms of the employment rate of this group of persons, the data shows that the persons with disabilities have the number of chances of employment as persons without disability. So the data, as you could see, you have about 3.7% for persons with disabilities and about 6.7% for persons without disabilities. Now, this data also correspond with data in other countries in the world as per the ILO, International Labour Organization statistics. So generally, the pattern there is clear that persons with disabilities are not equally represented in the labor force. And in terms of the delivery of goods and services, there are issues, they are placed at a disproportionate disadvantage. If we look at the reasons why this data, the reasons behind this data, in terms of employment, it is very clear that persons with disabilities suffer disproportionately in terms of entering and staying into employment. Why is it? There have been many, many reasons advanced for this particular phenomenon. One of the main reasons is that most employers generally tend to focus on the disability of persons with disabilities and not their abilities. That alone is enough to skew their perception of this group of persons and therefore prevent them from getting into the labor force. Related to this are issues around stereotype on the abilities of persons with disabilities. You also have issues of prejudice. Sum it up, you have fundamental issues of disability discrimination. Apart from that, in the context of disability, there's this issue which has been very perennial, which is that of the cost element. It is a very central issue in terms of disability equality. Why is it persons with disabilities are generally considered by most employers as very costly to maintain in the workforce? And though research has demonstrated that this is not necessarily true, but most employers still have this perception that employing disabled persons constitutes a burden in terms of the cost effectiveness to their businesses. So that has been a very, very fundamental barrier to persons with disabilities entering and staying in employment. As I said, this perception is not necessarily true because research has demonstrated that the cost element involved with disability, with employing disabled persons, are very minimal. And in certain instances, like in the UK, the cost is partly met through public funds. So employers generally should have no reason to complain or to use the cost element as a barrier to get employing persons with disabilities into their organizations. That said, in terms of what are some of the issues relating to this disproportionate data in relation to the employment of persons with disabilities, let's move now to look at why do we think people with disabilities should get equal chances in terms of employment and the delivery of services. That is basically what we will consider as the business case for disability equality. Now, when we look at the business case, we're looking primarily there's a distinction here that has to be made between the public sector and the private sector. Now, when generally the private sector is driven by profit maximization, and when they look at disability issues, they are looking at the return to their investment. And if they feel that disabled persons are not going to improve on their return on their investment, they are not likely to give them that opportunity to get into their employment. That is a very, very important economic consideration, which research has demonstrated that, again, employers are on the wrong side of history, in the sense that first, disabled persons have a lot to contribute to increase the investment potentials of employers. If you look, the research has demonstrated that persons with disabilities generally have abilities that could be very, very, very positive to the business of employers. We know fully well that we have cases of people, disabled persons are generally individuals with autism may be considered as one of the best computer specialists in the world. That apart, the simple fact that innovations, businesses thrive on innovations, and innovation comes about because you are able to blend ideas, perceptions, and perspectives of persons from different backgrounds, including disabled persons. So that could be a very positive aspect in terms of the economic dimension or the economic argument for involving persons with disabilities in the labor market. There is also the fact that disabled persons generally are research has demonstrated, as you could see from the bibliography, that there have been some research conducted and it has been proven that disabled persons, when employed, tend to be very loyal. And one of the things, setbacks or challenges which employers encounter in terms of their workforce is that of retention. Now, when the retention rate is very, very, very low, it could impact negatively on the profit margin of businesses. So employing disabled people, bringing them into the labor force with the degree of loyalty that they have, is something that could work positively to the advantage of employers and needs to be looked at critically when making decisions whether or not to employ persons with disabilities. There's lastly the issue of the disabled persons themselves, how they can get into the employment market. You look at generally issues around the way they employ the issues. I'll be looking here at issues around application forms and res, right? Now, getting disabled persons involved in these processes will be very, very, very helpful in alleviating some of the fears which employers have. But at the bottom line, when you have over 15% of the population, who, excluding this group of persons from the labor market in itself, tells you there is a problem there. And employers are not therefore exploiting the potential, the full potentials of this group of persons, right? In terms of service delivery, this number of persons, these disabled persons, constitute a very substantial majority of group of persons in terms of their ability to, their purchase power. Now, if organizations operate without taking this group of persons into consideration, they definitely, there is a potential there for they to undermine their own profit margin, because they are excluding their goods from a particular group of persons from their assessing their goods. And I don't think that could be a very positive aspect in their consideration when looking at their return on investment. That said, in terms of the economic, the argument for involving persons with disabilities, let us look at also that, because basically there are two arguments. There is the economic rationale, which I've just discussed. The second major argument which has been put forward is that of the human rights perspective. Now, with the human rights perspective, generally, there are certain issues which one could look at. The first is that of the citizen argument. Now, what basically that involves is that disabled persons, like every other person, are citizens who need their needs and concerns to be taken into account when policies are made. And employment is one of the areas where you could evolve, where citizens could exercise their rights. So the citizen argument is a very powerful one, which we will see when we come to looking at issues around the constitution of countries in terms of how the civil and non-discrimination dimension of it. The second thing which we need to look at when considering the human rights argument is that of the democratic argument. Basically, what this is all about is that when the democracy generally is there to counter totalitarianism, right? And we know that governments generally have a potential. They have a string of distributive social programs which they do execute. Now, if governments can decide when it comes to implementing social policies, generally, it is not about law, whether international or national laws. It is about politics. And there's evidence that when operating from that political perspective, governments can easily decide to marginalize certain groups of persons, especially those who don't have political clout or power, such as persons with disabilities. So if we have to maintain a democratic and open society that is inclusive of everyone, I think the disability argument is the starting point, given that, as I said earlier, these are a group of persons that constitute the greatest minority in the world. So if we have to push a democratic agenda, they should be the starting point. The other thing we need to look at when we consider the human rights argument is that of the economic and social rights perspective. Now, when there has been an overemphasis on the civil and political rights, as you know, human rights are generally divided into two. You have the civil and political rights in the one hand, and you have the economic and social rights in the other hand. Now, there has always been an overemphasis on the civil and political rights to the detriment, to an extent, of the civil and political rights. And one of the major precepts of human rights is the interdependence of these two rights. Okay. Now, when we struggle for civil and political rights, these rights have no meaning if it is not this, they are not underpinned by the material element of freedom. So if you have the freedom from emanating from the civil and political rights, this freedom has to be complemented by the material dimension. And that is, when it comes to disability, this provides a very powerful argument, because disabled persons are people who are a vulnerable group, and the provision of social services has been a very powerful tool to alleviate their quality of life. Now, when we, as I said, when we talk of freedom, poverty, lack of basic goods, that constitutes what I would call unfreedom. So if we have to look at freedom, we should look at freedom from a very wide perspective. That is the freedom that emanates from the complementarity of the civil and political rights in the one hand, and this economic and social rights on the other hand. The last argument, which I think is a very powerful one in terms of the human rights dimension, is that of what we perceive as human rights. Human rights generally is not just about the individual, about individual dignity, but it's also about the equal worth of each human being. Now, if we look at the issue of just the dignity of the individual without looking at the equality dimension of human beings, then there may be a problem there. And it is always important that we look at the human rights from that very broad perspective, as involving not just the inherent dignity of the individual, but the equal worth of every human being. So disabled persons should be treated as part of this equation and not as an adjunct. That at least provides a general overview of the arguments that have been presented. And of course, we could see these are very powerful arguments for the inclusion of persons with disabilities, not just in employment, but also in the delivery of goods and services. I think from that, we should be able now to look at some of the legal instruments that have been developed to protect and promote the rights of persons with disabilities, not just in employment, but also in the delivery of goods and services. Now, if we look back at what the explanation we provided when analyzing the data, it was evident that one of the major barriers to the employment of persons with disabilities, not just their employment, but their ability to stay in employment, is discrimination. So discrimination is a very central concept when looking at issues around disability equality. And when with discrimination, there have been two, the national governments have developed legislations around prohibiting discrimination, not just for disabled persons, but also for other individuals with what we call in the UK under the Equality Act, protected characteristics. Now, in the UK, which I'll use as the example here, the main legislation prohibiting discrimination is that of the Equality Act 2010. Now, the Equality Act, as I said, does not apply just to disabled persons, but applies to what the Act refers to as protected characteristics. And there are 9 characteristics protected under the Equality Act. Disability is one of the characteristics, okay? But what is important here is to understand how discrimination is defined by the Equality Act 2010. The Act defines discrimination in 4 different ways. So there is no one definition of discrimination under the Equality Act. Rather, it is defined in 4 different ways. Now, the first definition pertains to indirect discrimination. Let's take direct discrimination first before going to the indirect discrimination. Now, direct discrimination is defined by the Act in terms of less favorable treatment. Okay. Now, its applicability cuts across all the 9 characteristics, and the less favorable treatment here refers to it's contextualized in terms of the person who is being discriminated against suffering a detriment or a benefit. So for discrimination to amount to less favorable treatment, the individual must have either been refused or prevented from having a benefit, or must have suffered a detriment. So for persons with disabilities, we will need to prove that the act, the treatment, which is a less favorable treatment, resulted in you suffering a detriment or refusing you from enjoying a benefit. The problem with the Section 13 definition of direct discrimination is that there is the requirement of a comparator. Now, this has been a very perennial problem when it comes to disabled persons, because the Act requires the comparator to be in exactly the same situation as the disabled person making the complaint. And that comparator may not necessarily be a person with a disability. So it has not been a very powerful tool or weapon in terms of persons with disabilities trying to protect or bring complaints against the infringement of their rights. Now, the second definition of discrimination under the Equality Act is that of Section 15, which is what is generally called disability-related discrimination. The third, I'll go through the 4 before coming to explain detail first. I've just talked about the direct discrimination, which is Section 13. Now, Section 15 of the Act refers to what, as I said, is called disability-related discrimination. Here, the definition of discrimination is framed around the idea of unfavorable treatment. So, unlike direct discrimination that talks of less favorable treatment, the disability-related discrimination talks of unfavorable treatment arising because of the disability of the individual involved. I'll come back to that later when we look at what the CRPD, CRPD provisions of discrimination. The third definition of discrimination is that of indirect discrimination. Now, Section 19 of the Equality Act deals with indirect discrimination, and it is defined again in terms of the policies, criterion, and practice of an organization that disproportionately disadvantages a group of persons, i.e. disabled persons, and which again disadvantages the particular individual bringing the complaint of discrimination. Again, I'll come back to that when we look at the CRPD provisions. The fourth and last definition is that of the duty to make reasonable adjustment. This is a very important provision for persons with disabilities, and it is provided under Article 20 of the Equality Act, and it imposes a duty on employers, service providers and public authorities to make adjustments to persons with disabilities. Now, as I said, the concept of reasonable adjustment is one that is very unique to the English legal framework. And it is a very, very powerful tool, as we'll say, which, if used in conjunction with the CRPD, could dramatically change the position of persons with disabilities. So there are three elements under the Equality Act in terms of the duty to make reasonable adjustment. The first is that is the duty on the individuals concerned, that is the employers, service providers, to make adjustments, amend, adjust their policies, criterion, and practices, where such policies, practices, or criteria places the disabled person on a substantial disadvantage. The second is that of adjustments relating to built environment, that is in terms of their the buildings and other structures. The third, again, which I think is something we need to really take note of, is that which relates to the provision of auxiliary aids. So it is not enough to get a disabled person into employment. For instance, a blind employee, when that person is not provided with the relevant software that will enable them to perform their duties. So that provision of auxiliary aids, again, if we recognize the fact that this provision was not made explicit under the previous legislation of the Disability Equality, Disability Discrimination Act of 1995, I think this marks a very important leap forward in the Equality Act, that it has been able to identify the provision of auxiliary aid as one area where disabled persons could, but for that provision, be placed at a substantial disadvantage. Now, those are the four areas where, four definitions of discrimination. And if this is in the context of national legislation, using the example of the UK. Other countries like South Africa, in America, you have the disability. In America, yeah, the main legislation in America is the Americans with Disabilities Act, which again regulates protects persons with disabilities against discrimination, both in employment and the provision of goods and services. Other countries have their own specific national legislations, but the one thread that runs through most of these legislations is the acknowledgement that persons with disabilities constitute an insular minority and discrete minority that need some level of protection. And this is when researchers on disability are working, it is incumbent on them to look critically at some of these legislative provisions, because at the surface, at the face of it, they may be providing the requisite protection, but at a deeper level, depending, as I'll explain later, the type of protection that may be provided may not be substantial enough to change the circumstances of persons with disabilities in the context in which we are talking today. So that said, let's just have a quick look at, as I said, not all countries do provide, do have legislations specifically prohibiting discrimination. So in a country like, for instance, Cameroon, which is the country that I come from, there is no, and it's not just Cameroon, it looks like most African countries, sub-Saharan African countries, do not have this specific legislations dealing with disabilities or discrimination generally. There may be many reasons for that, which I don't think this is the appropriate place to explore those reasons. But what is important, the point I'm trying to make here is that where in the absence of specific legislation prohibiting discrimination, activists, advocates, researchers on disability issues could be able to use the provisions of the Constitution. Now, most constitutions, in fact, generally, most of the constitutions shall come across, make provisions in terms of equality. And we have to understand that the main thread that runs through all the civil and political rights on the one hand and economic and social rights on the other hand is the concept of equality. So the equality concepts, provisions in national constitutions could provide a very viable framework for individuals to challenge certain discriminatory practices against persons with disabilities. So it's something which, as I said, activists and advocates of disability equality should look critically at and see how they could use that platform to challenge these practices. In Cameroon, as mentioned, the 1996 Constitution, if I'm not wrong, Section 23 provides for requires the state to cater for the general well-being of the citizens. It goes further to talk about issues around equality between the various citizens, and there's also a provision there, I think, which talks specifically about the right to work. Now, as I said earlier, the right to work is a fundamental right, which is not only applicable to persons with disabilities, but it has general application. And I think advocates of disability equality could capitalize on that, considering the fact that the refusal or the violation of the right to work may amount to a violation of the human rights of a person with disabilities, whether it's in the context of the socio-economic rights. So it's nice that we look at those avenues which we could use to challenge discriminatory practices. In terms of international treaties or conventions, we all know that the most important international treaty relating to persons with disabilities is that of the CRPD, that is the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. This convention was initially promulgated in 2006, opened for ratification in 2007, and eventually came to force in 2008. A substantial number of countries have ratified the convention. But what is crucial with the convention is the fact that, as one author said, it is a remarkable legislation that has fundamentally challenged our conception of disability. And again, as the convention clearly provides, the aim of the convention is to protect, promote the rights of persons with disabilities and to ensure their full enjoyment of all human rights. So it's a rights-based legislation, which, as I said, is what needs to be emphasized here first and foremost is that once the countries that have ratified the convention, they are obliged to implement it, transpose it into national laws. So, unfortunately, as far as I'm aware, Cameroon is still to ratify the convention. It's something which I was recently briefed on, and we're trying to look at how we can work together with colleagues back home to see how we can change that situation and get the government to ratify and implement the provisions of the convention at the national level. Now, the convention, as I said, is a very important legislation, and some of the provisions of it, the one thing which is crucial is first the way the definition of disability within the convention. Now, most of the national legislations on discrimination, disability discrimination, tend to take what they call an individual model approach to disability, which ties to an extent to the medical model. So if you look at Section 6 of the Equality Act 2010, the definition of disability there has a strong medical undertone in the sense that it considers the disability largely from the perspective of the individual's impairment. There has been a corresponding movement towards what they call the social model of disability, which sees disability not in terms of the individual impairment, but in terms of the barriers, the social barriers, environmental barriers, which tends to prevent persons with an impairment from operating fully and effectively on equal terms with persons who are not disabled. So we do have conceptually, we have the individual and the group model of disability, and you have the medical and the social model of disability. Now, the group model of disability, as I said, the protection afforded by most of the national legislations tend to focus on providing remedy to the individual who has been a victim of discrimination. But we are aware that in most workplaces, most of the disadvantage that persons with disabilities suffer do not operate at an individual level. They do operate at the group level. And that gap in the conceptual framework of the legislation prohibiting discrimination has been a major concern to most disabled persons and advocates. And this led eventually to the adoption of what in the UK is called the duty on public authorities to promote this discrimination is called Public Sector Equality Duty, the SED. Now, the SED is under Section 149 of the Equality Act, imposes a duty generally on public authorities to, one, there are three elements of that duty. First, prohibit unlawful discrimination. I don't know why they have to use the word unlawful there, because discrimination is discrimination. It doesn't, the public authority does not have to wait until a discrimination is unlawful to prohibit it. Once it's discrimination, by definition, it is unlawful. The second element of that duty is that of advancing equality of opportunity. Now, it is very instructive that the legislation uses the word advancing. rather than promoting this equality of opportunity. Now, the word advance to me signifies a proactive approach. So it may be looking here at the level of employers at the workplaces. We may be looking at actions or moves by the employers, which will promote disability equality at a group level. So proactively, they will have to look at issues maybe in terms of training, see how they can, as a group, coach or promote this group of persons, make facilities training, non-mandatory training and the rest available to them. So that expression, advancing equality of opportunity, I think is something which is very, very instrumental, which again, we need to keep an eye on. The third element is that of promoting, fostering good relations between persons with disabilities and those without disabilities. Now we understand how disability discrimination operates within at a societal level, the stereotypes, the prejudice, the misconceptions that characterize disabilities. And these are some of the issues that create that social friction, which results in persons with disabilities being treated as a general is said in law, separate but equal. The concept of separate but equal. How you build good relations in the community could be a very important dimension in promoting inclusion for persons with disabilities. If we go back to the issue of the definition of disability under the CRPD, it is very instrumental that the CRPD does not adopt a strictly medical definition of disability. It is, in effect, it seems to envisage a more social model of disability because it defines disability in terms of the interaction between intellectual, mental, physical impairment and the environmental barriers, social barriers that prevent, inhibit persons with disabilities from enjoying the full, the rights, the full dimensions of the human rights envisaged under the convention. So adopting that particular approach to the definition of this disability is very, very important in us understanding the conceptual framework in which how we perceive the issues relating to the barriers of to persons with disabilities, both in employment and in service delivery. Again, it hinges on what Quinn calls the personhood of the individual. If we are looking at a rights-based approach to disability, then the way we perceive the individual is very, very important in terms of giving them, empowering them with what it takes to operate as full citizens within their communities. So a social model of disability has the potential, therefore, of pushing the frontiers in terms of, as I said, the way we, the type of policies we develop to include persons with disabilities within the labor market and the enjoyment of goods and services within the community. The other thing which we need to know about the definition of disabilities and what the CRPD provides, it's that of reasonable adjustment. As I said earlier, reasonable adjustment is a concept that is very, very prevalent in the UK Equality Act as one of the protections offered to persons with disabilities. That concept is also reflected in the CRPD. If you look at Article 2 of the CRPD, the way it is defined in terms of any modifications or adjustments, but the thing which, one of the things which we need to, as I said earlier, we have to be very critical when we look at the national legislations as compared to what the CRPD provides. The CRPD, as I said earlier, is a very important instrument. And to me, the importance, apart from the implementation and monitoring mechanisms that are available under the CRPD, one of the most important aspects of the CRPD is the fact that it provides, to me, a repository of norms that should be able to guide our perception and evolution, the evolution of issues around disability. So the way disability is defined under the CRPD, if you look at Article 1, as I said, it envisages a combination of a medical model and the social model, but the predominance is the medical, social model approach. So if that is the framework we have to operate, then the focus there should be on the removal of barriers and not the impairment of the individual. The second thing which, hello?
Dr. Effiom, I'm very sorry to interrupt. This is Lynn. Excellent presentation. And our problem is that we're almost out of time.
Oh.
I'm going to suggest that you come back in a few weeks for part 2, because there are many, many more things that we want to hear from you. So I'm very sorry to interrupt, but I'm just wondering if perhaps we could have a few minutes for comments or questions. We only have about 5 minutes left in the time that we have. Would that be okay? Would you be willing to come back?
Yeah, that's fine with me.
Thank you.
Yeah, it looks like it's a very loaded topic, so we need to explore it further.
Exactly, exactly. I'm just going to begin by commenting how appreciative I am that you made a link between the usefulness of research to understanding things like what reasonable adjustment actually means and how it can be used. And that research has shown that it doesn't cost more to hire people with disabilities, and that employment can actually be productive in many ways. So thank you for making that link to having good research.
That's right.
Does anyone else want to make a comment or ask a question?
Yes, please. Hello.
Go ahead, Vitalis.
Okay. Thank you very much, Doctor. I am David Vitalis. I'm talking from Ground Zero.
Oh, hi.
So, in your presentation, I actually recorded one word which took through your presentation. That is unemployment. I don't know the rate. I don't know whether you have rated the rate of persons, the rate of employment in the developed world than I mean I don't know if you have actually compared the rate of unemployment of the developed world and that of the developing countries. And the second question is, um, how much how much does it actually need us in the developing world to actually have to actually attain the level of employment of persons with disabilities in the developed world? Um, there's another question which I've
So
forgotten. I may come back
Vitalis,
for it. If you don't mind.
Vitalis, thank you very much for those questions. I'm going to ask us to hold that to our next session with Dr. Effiom, because he will really concentrate on workplaces in the next session.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine, Dean.
But Dr. Effiom, do you have a quick response to that?
Yeah, yes. The last question he asked, what will it take to get the unemployment rate for persons with disabilities in the developing country, the developing country? Yeah. What I'll say quickly there is that first, in most African countries or developing countries, we still are tied to the social welfare approach to disability. And that is a very, insofar as it has been it is very useful in terms of providing the material underpinning to disability. But it's not an approach that is capable of lifting persons with disabilities and giving them, making them stay to enter and stay in employment. So that the continued focus on the social welfare approach could be a drawback. The second thing I noticed, especially if you read my article on the human rights in Cameroon, is the fact that the very organizations, i.e. the human rights bodies that have been created to promote rights of persons, to protect, promote human rights, do not engage proactively with the private sector. Now, the private sector provides, is a major employer, apart from the public sector. We need to proactively engage with the private sector. In fact, majority of the discrimination that barriers to employment come from the private sector, because the public sector is open to scrutiny. As I said, if you reflect on the democratic principle I discussed earlier in terms of the human rights perspective, the public sector are more to make an sense of employment, even though they operate at the same level as those of the developed world. But the private sector is where I think emphasis has to be laid. So I think for that should provide you some sort of food for reflection for now.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We do have some.
Yes, if there's any other question, let them just, so that I can provide whatever answer I can quickly.
Well, again, I think we need to wrap up. So I'm going to give this as a teaser, and we'll be thinking about it for the next session when you join us. But the question of competence and employability of people with disabilities or persons with disability. There is a myth that people are not as competent. And so there's a question, if you could address that.
Yeah, that is a perception rather than the reality. What I said earlier, that the research has demonstrated that, for instance, people with autism are they tend to be very good computer IT analysts. Myself, I have a disability. I was not born with a disability. I developed a disability midway in life. I was able to go back to school and do a PhD with my disability. I lost my sight, but the switch from a sighted person to a blind person could be a unique experience in life. And it is this experience that I take into my workplace and make a difference. So it is not only the transactional dimension of work that we define competence. Competence should be given a much more broader meaning rather than just looking at academic qualifications. Look at the other skills, the soft skills, and the rest that the persons with disability can bring. So it hinges on how we perceive competence. Traditionally, we've looked at it on the merit principle has guided our perception or understanding of competence. But that has to change because we can see with the pandemic, it is now not a matter of how many degrees you have, paper qualification, but it's your ability to, those other skills that are not necessarily qualified in terms of qualifications that are important. So, yeah.
Thank you. So we are going to formally end here. Dr. Effiom, thank you so much for your very, very comprehensive comments, but also you presented it in a way that we could follow what you were saying. So that was, we really appreciate how you arranged your talk. And as I said earlier, we will have you back very soon to do the second part and maybe even a third part if you're willing, because there's so much to discuss in this area. I also want to say thank you to Sarah for arranging the webinar and assisting Dr. Effiom with the slides. Sarah has been working very diligently and quite a bit in the background. So thank you, Sarah. Our next webinar will be announced by email. It will be in 2 weeks, and we'll just confirm whether it will be Dr. Effiom or another presenter, and we will send that out as soon as we can by email. Dr. Effiom, thank you again.
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you, Sarah, and thanks everyone for joining this webinar. I hope we'll leave with at least something to reflect on. And as I said, working in concert, we can make a difference to the lives of disabled persons in our various countries. Thank you.
Thank you, and bye for now.
Bye.